Welcome again, everyone, to our workshop today. I don't know what that means, helping students understand the language of research. I am really excited to have you all here today. It's great that we have such a big audience. We just went over 200 participants, which is absolutely amazing. Um, so I so appreciate you all taking your time out of your day to be here with me today. My name is Jane Hammonds. I'm an associate professor and the teaching and learning engagement librarian in the university libraries at The Ohio State University. You can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu, and I'm always happy to talk more with you about the content of the workshop today, or the endorsement, or the certificate program, or anything else that you might be interested in. Today, we're going to talk about how language barriers may contribute to student challenges in completing research assignments, and talk specifically about what some examples of those language barriers might be. And then we'll think about some strategies and activities that we might be able to use to help clarify key research related terms and concepts for students. Okay, so let's jump in and talk about the language of research and what we mean by this and what examples of this might look like. Have a couple of quick activities for you. So I'm going to put in the chat again some links. One of the links you'll see on there is a link to a journal. So our first activity, we're going to do a poll on this. So I'll launch the poll in a second. But what I'm going to have you do is, if you want to take a look at that journal link that's in the chat, that's going to take you out to a journal that's called College and Research Libraries. And I want to give everyone a chance to just take a look at that journal really quickly. I know that some of you are already probably pretty familiar with this journal, but some of you may not. So I want to give you all a chance to take a look at this journal if you're interested in doing so. And then I'm going to launch a poll to have you identify what type of journal this is. If it's an academic journal, a peer-reviewed journal, a scholarly journal, a research journal, maybe all of the above or none of the above. You'll have options to pick as many of those as you think are the correct answer. So again, the link to the journal, if you are not familiar with it, is in the chat. That could take you out to the journal so that you can take a look. And then I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll and give everyone a chance to share their response as to what type of journal this is. Are folks seeing the poll? Yeah, see responses coming in. So we'll give it just a few more seconds. And again, if you've already finished and you want to, feel free to share in the chat why you made the decision that you did or what you looked for to make your answer. I'd love to hear any of the thought process that folks had in mind, but we'll give it just a few more seconds to let folks share their responses here. And then I'll share those results. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End poll and share the results. Okay, so hopefully everyone is seeing the results. So you can see here that about 68% of the responses said that this is all of the above. So it is an academic journal, a peer-reviewed journal, a scholarly journal, and a research journal. And then for specific responses, we have different percentages there in terms of whether folks thought it was more a scholarly journal or a peer-reviewed journal. But we did have a few folks in here that indicated that it is none of the above. So you can see that there's some perhaps uncertainty or disagreement about what type of resource this might be. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and take a look at the chat. See what kind of responses there. So folks are talking about what they looked at. So looked on the about page to try to figure that out. Darcy said looked on the statement on the main page to determine. Ellen shared it only asked for local peer review under author guidelines. Kelly shared, Wikipedia says bi-monthly peer-reviewed academic journal. So Adrian shared, I chose academic journal because while it does contain peer-reviewed articles, not all articles are peer-reviewed. So scholarly is not really a precise descriptor. Research is present, so perhaps that could be correct too. Ilana said, I checked Ulrich's. Yeah, great response there too. So folks looked at a lot of different things to make their decisions. And you can see that there's some nuance or some complexity to the answers that folks gave. So a lot of folks thought it was all of them, but other folks are saying, well, maybe it's, some of the articles are in there are peer reviewed, but not all of them are. So maybe scholarly is not the best term. So Mary has there, many of those terms are somewhat synonymous. Yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, thank you all so much. So Maria shared, so on the published page, it states that they use double anonymous reviewing. So that indicates it's peer review. ACRL says C and D in their descriptions. Yeah, Adair, yes, academic research and scholarly are all incredibly vague terms. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think that this is a hopefully an interesting and great activity for us to think about some of the challenges that we might have with precision language and how we describe different types of sources or resources that our students might use as part of the research process. So thank you all for sharing your responses there. Right. So I have another quick activity for us. And again, put these in the chat. So you should see a link in there to an article. So this will take you out to an article to take a look at. So the scenario that we're looking for here is that a student named Trixie, which happens to be my cat's name, is told that she can only include sources from scholarly journals, right? And so she finds this particular article. She looks in EBSCO and she says that in EBSCO, she sees that it's listed as an academic journal. So she's not sure whether if it's an academic journal, that counts the same as being a scholarly journal. Right. So this happens to be an article that I co-wrote with one of my friends. So I just shared that one as an example. So I'm going to launch the poll. And our question is, would this article count as coming from a scholarly journal based on what you can see about from it? All right. So we're going to go ahead and launch the second poll here. I'm going to go back. Launch the second poll. Okay, so hopefully you should be seeing that as the second poll. So your question is, does this count as a source from a scholarly journal? Folks seeing the poll? Looks like maybe not. We'll try it again. Okay, I'm gonna go back one more time. Let me try this again. No, I won't. Relaunch poll. All right, maybe now folks are seeing the poll. There we go. Sorry about that. So our question is, does this count as a source from a scholarly journal? Right, so we got a lot of folks that responded. We'll try to give it about 10 more seconds or so to let folks respond. And again, if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, so why you made your decision, why you thought it was scholarly or not, you can feel free to share that as well. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to end this poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so hopefully folks should be seeing the results there. So you can see that we have about 60% say that this yes does count as a source from a scholarly journal. About 27% said no, and about 13% were not sure. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and close that poll. All right, so let's take a look at the chat and see what folks are thinking. So Shauna, I would classify this as a trade journal. Mary shared that this is a professional journal, but the articles are not peer-reviewed. So Nancy shared, based on the information available, I would say yes, but the student might want to check with the instructor. Yep. So most folks are kind of saying that it's a news magazine or it's a trade journal. It may be, Audrey said it's scholarly, but not peer-reviewed. So it would kind of depend on whether the instructor made that distinction about whether it needs to be peer-reviewed or whether it needs to be, you know, scholarly more broadly. Right? Okay, yeah, great responses. So you might be interested to see how EBSCO would classify this, or what they say about the distinction between academic and scholarly and peer review. So you can see this information here. So EBSCO uses the term academic more broadly, right? So academic is a broader category of articles that are intended for an academic audience or a research community of some kind. But a subcategory within academic journals are specifically scholarly peer review articles, and they include scholarly and peer review as the same thing. So people were making different kinds of distinctions in their responses in the chat about academic or scholarly and peer review. So in the case of EBSCO, at least, they classify academic as the broader category and then scholarly and peer reviewed as a more specific category. So in this case, it seems like if you went by EBSCO's guidelines, the article that that Trixie found would be considered an academic journal article, but it would not be considered a scholarly article because EBSCO considers scholarly articles to be the same as peer-reviewed articles. What kind of guidance could Trixie get if she looked online to try to figure this out? She would get different kinds of guidance about what happens. So as I said, EBSCO considered scholarly and peer-reviewed articles basically to be the same thing. The first guidance that you see here says that not all scholarly articles are peer-reviewed, so seems to make a distinction. The next guidance seems to say that academic and scholarly are usually considered interchangeable. The third link says scholarly journal and academic article are two words for the same thing. And then the final one puts all of these categories together, that scholarly, academic journals, scientific journals, and peer-reviewed journals, basically presents them as being the same thing, right? And if you're from any of these institutions, I am not at all criticizing you. I'm just sharing this as an example of the fact that the guidance that is out there on this topic is confusing. This seems to be not really a settled matter where everyone has come to an agreement about what the distinction exactly might be between scholarly or peer-reviewed or academic articles. So I wanted to share those examples. I think those are examples of activities that you could do with instructors or that you could do with students to help start them to think about some of these challenges related to language issues. Right. And it kind of gets to this big picture is that we expect students to be familiar with a wide range of research related terms. And as instructors, we may have difficulty recognizing that the way that we are using the term may not be a way that is familiar with the students. They may not understand what we mean by that term, or we may not be using the term in the same way that an instructor in another class they are teaching may be using that term. So this type of language barrier can create a lot of frustrations for students. So thinking about the example that we just had, in most cases, I would say that student would be fine in including the article that they found as a scholarly source. But as someone pointed out in the chat, if what the instructor really meant was peer-reviewed source, then that article would not fit. But that's a level of distinction that is not really clear based on just saying that the student should use scholarly articles. Right. So I argue again that clarifying language can really help to create a more equitable learning environment for all students because it can, put all students on more of the same level of being familiar and being clear about what the expectations the instructor really has for that assignment. So I wanted to share, some additional examples of the types of terms that students might find challenging. And I'm going to be talking more specifically about the types of research terms that are related to more library research. If you're an instructor, please feel free to think more broadly about the types of terms that would be associated with experimental research or field research or laboratory research. So you can think as big or small about the research terms as you would like. So there's been some research and some studies looking at what kinds of terms students have trouble understanding. And this was a great study that was published a couple of years ago, where the authors looked at terms that are included on syllabi and had students try to identify what those terms are. And they found that the terms that were most frequently used in the syllabi were the terms that the students least understood, right? So some of the terms, we're going to talk about some of the terms that students have trouble with in a second. But I did want to give you a chance to share your understanding and your perspective of what are some of the terms that students really struggle with research. So we can do this as a Padlet, Padlet. So I'm going to put that link there. So you should see the Padlet again, the link to that in the slides. So I want to give everyone a chance to go out and think about, in whatever context you teach research and whatever type of research you're talking about, what are the terms that students seem to have the most trouble understanding? I'm going to go ahead and go out to the Padlet. And this is kind of a different one if you've been to some of my presentations before. So this is their whiteboard version of the Padlet. So what you can do is over here on the right-hand side, you can either type your response in if you would like, or you can also go over here, you have an option to add a note. You can pick your color, and then if you put your mouse on the screen, it will create your note there where you can add the note. So however you would like to respond, if you would like to respond by adding a note, if you would like to just type your response in, go ahead and share those there. This is the new Padlet whiteboard version that they're trying to use to replace Jamboard. So we're trying this out to see how this works. So I'll give everyone a chance to share their response there. And I'm going to take a picture of this so that I can share this with my colleagues so they see what this looks like. So we can make a decision about how this actually works. Yeah, seeing everyone move on the screen, that's a really interesting. It might be that this would work better with a smaller audience. Yeah. So yeah, please feel free to share your responses on how this tool works, because this is the first time I'm trying this. Yeah, great comments. I'm looking at folks' comments coming in the chat about that activity, making you think about the distinctions and how important context is, what the instructor's actual expectations or guidance are in terms of how you can make distinctions between those two terms. Yeah, Mary shared a great response there that different library database providers may use different terms and different descriptions of what academic versus peer-reviewed versus scholarly is. I always explicitly ask the instructor what they mean by scholarly. I think that's a great idea, Ashley, for sure. All right. Yeah, it seems like it's maybe a little bit overwhelming and a little bit chaotic to have so much stuff on one screen here. Yeah, for sure. All right. So yeah, I can't really see, I guess, unless folks move their mouse away, it's kind of hard to see if everyone's mouse is on there. So yeah, that's interesting thinking about this as a tool. But some of the responses that I'm seeing there, the ones that students tend to have trouble with, I see database in there several times. I see literature review in there several times, peer reviewed, journal versus article. Yeah, synthesize, monograph, evidence-based. Yeah. Let's see, research. Yeah, that's a great point, that research itself. I'm going to mention that one in a second as well. So you can see there's all of these examples of all of these types of terms that students might have trouble with. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing your responses there and for sharing your feedback on using this tool. I think this probably will not be one that I try to use again with an audience of this size. All right, I'm going to go ahead and try to go back to my presentation here. I'm going to escape out of there and go back here. All right, so hopefully everyone should be seeing the slides again. So the article by Schaub and colleagues, some of the terms that they found that students had difficulty with were the same ones that you all noted on the Padlet: scholarly, source, open access, peer review, database, journal, abstract. All of those are ones that students could really struggle with. And then there was an additional article that was published just recently And this was really looking at website usability, but the terms were kind of this along the same lines of the terms that students really had trouble with, or users in general. So catalog, citation, interlibrary loan, peer reviews, periodical, scholarly. And the ones that they most seemed to have trouble with were journals, articles, and databases. So those are some great examples of the challenges and the types of terms that students might find really challenging. All right. So I have one more activity. Oh, if you click on play, okay, thank you. Yeah. So if we have one more activity on term thinking about the types of terms that students might challenge with. So this is going to give you some verbs and have you try to match the verb with the definition. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and this is a matching poll. This is the first time I've used a matching poll, so we'll see how well this works as well. But we're going to go back here. And the goal of this is going to be for you to match the verb with the descriptions or the action that you would actually want to take. All right, so I'm going to launch this poll here. Hopefully folks are seeing the poll. If you're not, please do let me know. So I'm not seeing any comments that folks are not seeing the poll. And I know this one will take a little bit more time. Oh my gosh, we're already halfway through. Okay, thank you for sharing that, Ashley. That is great feedback. I will keep that in mind, thinking about the how to use the polls going forward. Again, yeah, as I said, I'm trying a couple new things today to see how things work out. So I appreciate the feedback that you all are giving. Yes. Yeah, I figured that this is a great audience to try out a few different things that folks might appreciate. You know, thinking about things that they are considering trying and whether how they might work in their classes. Yeah. So as you put your response in there, please feel free to share how easy or difficult you found this to be, and or what challenges that you might have associated by completing this. And I'll give everyone a few more seconds to complete this because we're already rapidly running out of time and I have so much more to cover. This maybe perhaps should have been a 75-minute one. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll in about 10 seconds here. And I'm going to end that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So let's see. It looks like, so it's kind of interesting to see how folks shared the responses here. All right. So it looks like we did have some differences in the types of responses that folks gave. So if you're able to see the different colors on there, and I apologize if you can't, I wasn't sure how this would display. The different colors indicate the number of folks who gave a different response. So you can see that there was disagreement, for example, about what disgust means. With several folks picking one term, about 57% said this term. So you can see that on these responses, there was not agreement from folks about how what the terms actually meant. Right, so yeah, thank you all so much for sharing your responses there. Take a look at the chat and see what folks are saying there. Yeah, that was difficulty. There was some overlap in the definitions. Yes, so folks are talking about it was difficult due to similarities and vagueness. It was hard. I feel like understanding the general expectations. Yeah, very difficult to tell which was which. difficult because the answers were too similar, that they're all overlapping. Yeah, that was a hard poll. Yeah, so I completely agree. I would have struggled with that myself. So I didn't mean to stress anyone out at all. But the point is just that we use a lot of these action verbs like analyze and apply and critique and describe and evaluate. And we may have very specific things that we mean by these terms, but the distinction, between the terms may not be clear to students. It may not always be clear to us exactly what we're asking students to do because we just use these terms that are familiar to us, right? And so it doesn't matter if we ask students to describe something versus define something. Those do have different meanings, but how important it is which term that we use. So I just wanted to share that as an example again of how the language that we use can create these challenges that we have for students. A few things I want to clarify really quickly in terms of other reasons why other challenges that students might have. I'm sure the librarians in the group out there have probably heard this, and probably instructors as well. Students often have difficulty distinguishing between the content and the container. So an example of this is that everything you find online is a website, which is of course not the case. Another example of this is that students will often have trouble distinguishing between journal and article, right? So I've had many students say that the author wrote a journal when that means that they wrote an article, right? So the content container is something that can be really challenging for students. And someone had mentioned this in the Padlet as well, that research itself can have very different meanings, right? Depending on what context you're in, what counts as research, what qualifies as research, can have significantly different meanings. So if a student has a research assignment in one class, it can look very different than a research assignment in another class. My colleague often tends to talk about big R research versus little r research. So big R research meaning like experimental research or laboratory research where they're actually getting out there and doing some sort of experiment or something, versus little r research as the more sort of library-based information type of research. But that's another term that could throw students off. Right. So I just wanted to share those. I wanted to go through, and I'm going to try to go through this really quickly since I know we already are running out of time so rapidly. But some of the factors that might contribute to some of these language barriers that students might have. So if folks are familiar with the book How Learning Works by Susan Ambrose, this is the older version. There's a newer version that has a different author, has a different group of authors. But from the 2010 version from Susan Ambrose, they talk a lot about prior knowledge. And they talk about the way that prior knowledge can help or hinder students' learning. And one type of prior knowledge that students might have, they refer to as accurate but inappropriate prior knowledge. So it's not necessarily what the student thinks is wrong or knows about a term is wrong, but it's just that understanding, that original understanding that they have, is confusing or hindering their ability to understand it in the particular context. So two examples of this are terms that have an everyday meaning and then a more technical or professional meaning. And the prior knowledge that students have about that everyday meaning could create difficulty with their understanding of the use of the meaning in the academic research context. Someone had also mentioned this, right? There's a lot of differences between discipline, between how certain terms might be used. So if they have knowledge from one discipline and they fail to recognize that they're in a different context, that could also create challenges in understanding the language. So I'd love to hear if you all have examples of research-related terms that have an everyday meaning, but have a more specific meaning within the context of research that could throw a student off. So what is something that has an everyday, ordinary meaning that a student might use, but has a more specific meaning in the research context and might throw students off track? And you can put your response just in the chat. Yes, study. Yes, article. Yeah, peer review. Absolutely. Literature, bias, evaluate, search. Yes, popular. Yeah, trade. Peer reviewed. Yeah, folks are mentioning like peer reviewed. In some places that means, in class they're reviewing their fellow students' work and they don't understand peer review in the context of academic research. Yeah, literature review, discipline. Yes, absolutely. Search, browse, abstract, evidence. Yes, primary sources. Yeah, references, abstract. Yeah, these are all such great responses, right? So some of the ones that I wanted to highlight, the ones that I've seen the most, but you all gave other examples that are great. But a lot of students have difficulty with journal because of the previous association with journals as more of a diary. Literature, of course, citation, abstract. A lot of folks mentioned peer review, evidence, a lot of great other examples of terms that have these everyday meanings, but have these more specific meanings in the context of research that could throw students off. As we already mentioned, right, disciplinary differences can really be key. We already talked about research itself can look very different depending on discipline, what we mean by that term. A really common example here is the difference between primary or secondary source, or primary literature and secondary source, that those can mean different things and look differently to a student depending on what discipline there are. And I'm sure that you all can think of other examples as well where terms may have a specific meaning in one discipline, but a different meaning in another discipline. This is something that we already talked about, but I thought it was worth highlighting just again, right? All of the different variations of terms that we use to describe the same thing or similar things. This is just one example, but academic, peer-reviewed, scholarly, refereed, research, empirical, they may mean the same thing, they may not. It depends on the context, it depends on what the instructor is looking for, and if the instructor is not clear, it can really throw students off. And I'm sure that there are many other research related terms that we could talk about that have multiple terms that people tend to use. And we sort of just accept that we recognize that these kind of mean the same thing, but we also recognize that in certain contexts, they may not mean the same thing, right? So it can be really challenging for students. I also wanted to point out this idea that even if we get past the issue of like scholarly or peer-reviewed articles, once they get into using scholarly articles, there's all these different subtypes of sources or scholarly sources that students might use. What is the difference between a literature review and a systematic review and a meta-analysis? Those are different things, but how clearly are students going to be able to recognize the difference between those terms and the different types of research terms that students might encounter? And so all of these are examples of challenges and things that could cause students to have difficulty as part of the research process. So I think this all goes back again to this idea of the expert novice gap. If you were here for the workshop net last week, I talked a lot about the expert novice gap, right? But the main point is that as we become more experienced in our discipline, as we become more experienced as academic researchers in general, certain understandings or concepts become just natural to us or so ingrained with us that we don't really have to think about them more, or we just kind of use a shorthand that scholars have come to understand what certain terms mean or certain terms don't mean. And we may not recognize that students just don't have that same understanding, right? Where for us, it may be, we may interchangeably use academic journal and peer reviewed journal, or academic journal and scholarly journal. A student may really think of those as being very different things or not see the nuance involved in making distinctions between those terms, right? So as we become more experienced, as we talked about, sort of after we cross the threshold and start thinking about things the way that an expert does, it becomes very difficult to see things from the perspective of a novice learner. And I spelled learner wrong, just noticed that. So, we have to think about how can we put ourselves in the shoes of students and start to recognize some of these terms that might be challenging for them to understand, and how we can provide more guidance to them to help them through and understand what our expectations are. All right, so I'm going to pause here for a few seconds for questions. And then for the last part of the workshop, I'm going to share some ideas about activities that you might be able to use, or things that you could do to help students learn, understand these terms a little bit more. But I'll pause here to see if there are any questions or comments. Again, if you have a really specific question you want me to answer, it's best if you put that in the Q&A so that I can see it. And if not, I'll just take a look at the comments really quickly and see what folks are talking about. Yeah, Kelly, that's a great point, right? A literature review in a paper versus a literature review paper. Yes, yeah. Review article versus book review. Yeah, that's also challenging. Yeah, original research article Adrienne has in there. And also like, okay, what's an unoriginal research article? What counts as data? Yeah. Bibliography, citation. Folks have such great comments in there. Um, yeah. Let's see. Comment coming in the Q&A. Yeah, so that's a great question, John. So John has a Q&A. We often try to activate prior knowledge. How do we keep prior knowledge from causing confusion? So that's a great point. And I think one of the key things is um, we have to give students a chance. I'm going to talk about some activities where they can share their prior knowledge. And if we recognize that their prior knowledge is wrong, we have to address that as soon as possible. But we have to address it multiple times, right? We know that if we've known something or thought we've known something for a while, it can be really difficult to challenge prior knowledge. So it's important that I think that we very specifically address prior knowledge and do things like, in the past, you may have heard primary source used as this type of source. In this course specifically, this is what we mean by primary source, right? So we have to specifically give that feedback, address those misconceptions that students have directly, and do it multiple times because it will not be something that will sink in right away for students. Yeah. Yes, another example of prior knowledge is about the databases that students use, right? If they learn how to use one database, they tend to want to use that database for everything, even though it's not going to be discipline for specific. And again, so I think we have to start thinking about how we can recognize in advance what those misconceptions or that prior knowledge that may be leading them wrong, address it specifically and address it multiple times going forward. So I wanted to share some strategies and resources that might be helpful to folks in these last few minutes. So I have a quick assignment here. I'll put this link in the chat there one more time. So you should see an assignment annotation link there. And what you can do, this should take you out to an online Word document. And what you can do is go to that document and highlight or comment on the terms or phrases that you think that students might need more support on. So I'm going to try to go out there myself. Hopefully folks are seeing that. So you can use the highlighting, you can use the commenting feature, whatever works for you. Hopefully folks are seeing this assignment. This is a completely fake assignment that I just made up. But I had fun doing it, and you can share your thoughts and comments there. Hopefully everyone is seeing the assignment. You can see all of the things that folks are highlighting. So some of the things that folks have noted, that students may not know what an academic analysis is, terms such as define or describe, analyze or interpret. You may not know what scholarly consideration is, what a scholarly journal is, what academic or popular sources are, what sources are in general. They might know library databases, citations, they may not know that. Criteria, that's a term that they may not know, right? Can students distinguish between types of sources? Yeah, clarity, strength. So you can see that there's a lot in this activity, right? There's no clarity on the specific citation style. Exactly, yeah. So you can see with this assignment, there's a lot of things that may create challenges for students. There's a lot of assumptions that the instructor, i.e. me, is making about what students would understand and be able to do with an assignment like this. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint, but I think this is a fun example of an assignment that you might be able to do with your students or with instructors or as an instructor, if you are an instructor, going through an assignment and either yourself as the instructor or working with your students or working with students in a class, having them go through and highlight the words or the terms that they don't understand, ask any questions on the assignment, the sheet that they don't understand, concepts, verbs that may need additional explanation. And then the instructor, what you can do is, okay, as I'm looking at, I'm seeing that these terms that students are having difficulty understanding, I can write out short descriptions of what these terms mean and include those in the assignment to give students more guidance. And I've given some resources here on uh, definitions or words that you can use to help clarify what some of these terms are. I've got some resources here on how students can decode or interpret their assignments. So these are the types of activities that you can do as an instructor. You can do with your students, or you could do with instructors that you're working with, if you're a librarian working with instructors, to help them to see the words within an assignment that might be challenging for students. Right. So I didn't go ahead and revise the entire assignment, but I did go through and say, okay, here's one way that an instructor could revise their assignment. So there's a sentence there, you should provide evidence, and I put citations in parentheses so that students would recognize that evidence means citations. And then I have this where you can use academic popular sources, and I included a specific description of what academic and popular sources are there so that students would have a better understanding. So doing some revision to your assignment, using that activity to highlight the assignment and then providing students with more specific guidance, I think could be really helpful. One of the things that I think is really helpful with the LMS system, especially if you use Canvas, I'm not sure if other LMS systems work exactly the same, but at least in Canvas, you're allowed to link out to various types of resources. And so one of the things you can do is if you have your assignments in Canvas, put a link to those words that you think that students might have trouble with. So, if literature review is one of those words, have a link out to a video about literature reviews or a description of literature reviews. Students that need that information can use that link. Students that don't, wouldn't have to use that link. If you are at Ohio State, I'll mention on our instructor resources page, we have readings and videos on key concepts that are available. So you could link directly to some of those resources in your course. But I think thinking about as you're going through how you're presenting assignment, are there ways that you can link out or provide additional descriptions or information for some of those key terms so that you're providing a little bit more of clarification and guidance for students. This is a thing where I thought AI could be really interesting to think about how you might use this as part of the assignment. So I went to ChatGPT and I put that assignment in ChatGPT and I gave it a prompt saying, you're teaching a class for first-year students, and it's indicating that some of these terms our students are having trouble with. So can you revise this assignment, highlighting key terms and providing definitions for some of these key terms that students are having trouble with? So ChatGPT, this is what it had looked like. So you can see that it put a separate section in the assignment of key terms to understand and highlighted each of those terms going through and outlined what those were. And I thought it did a pretty good job of describing what those terms were. So that could be something, that could be really helpful, an interesting and fun way to use an AI tool to get it to help you give more clarification for students on what assignments, what those key terms mean. I also did something slightly different, and I asked ChatGPT, and the first time I told it which words they were having trouble with. This time I asked it to analyze this assignment as if you were a first-year student. What are the terms that students would have trouble identifying? And this is the list of terms that it said that students would have trouble identifying. And I thought this was pretty good, right? It said that students wouldn't know what academic analysis meant. They might not know what tradition meant, or evidence, or sources, or scholarly journal. So it did a pretty good job of going through and highlighting for me, these are the terms that students might have trouble with. So I thought that just was an interesting use of how, you might be able to use AI tools to help you clarify language for students. So we talked about interpreting the research assignment. Students could also do an activity where they interpret a scholarly article to help them understand the key terms of the scholarly article. So giving them a scholarly article together and having them go through and annotate that assignment, talking about the language, right? So not necessarily about the content of the article, but having them learn about the language. You can do a hypothesis or some other annotation tool, social annotation tool, but having them go through an article and say, okay, it says there's a literature review here. What does that mean by that? They can go through those articles and get familiar using those assignments, identifying those key terms that they are struggling with, and getting some descriptions of those terms. In a bigger picture, if you're in the position where you're an instructor, Creating a glossary of key terms in your course could be something that you could do. You could post it in the LMS, or have a glossary somewhere. Of course, glossary itself is probably a term that many students are not going to recognize. But having a glossary of key terms somewhere that students could constantly refer back to is something that could be helpful. I put some examples here. Many libraries have created their own glossaries of key terms that you could use. You could work with colleagues in your department or discipline to identify a list of key terms that are commonly used. If you're a librarian, you could work with your colleagues and say, we're going to try to come together with some key descriptions of some of these key terms, and so that we are using, at least as librarian instructors, that we are using consistent language on some of these terms. So developing these shared definitions, maybe sharing them with instructors on your campus. So there are certain ways that it's sort of a course or a program level you could work. So I have one more quick activity here. I don't know if we're going to have time to do this one, but this is just an example of like a pre-test that you could do. So one of the questions was about identifying prior knowledge. And so this is an example of a question. The students have to do a literature review assignment, and you ask them to provide, okay, which of these is the definition that most accurately captures what a literature review is. And you could just have them do a quick pre-test on some of these key terms that that are coming up in the assignments that they're working on. And that would give you some feedback to allow you to give them more guidance on the terms that they use. At the beginning, of course, we did those polls where they were like looking at keywords or key terms. And you could do something like that with students as well, so that you're getting some feedback on what they're understanding and what they don't understand. I think collaborative definition building could also be really good. So at the beginning of a class, for example, providing the students with a list of key research terms that you're going to encounter, and working together, with the students to create shared definitions of those terms. I think that could be helpful as well, right, in getting to that issue of inaccurate prior knowledge. If they are working together to create those definitions and recognizing that those are the definitions that they are using in the context of their class, that could perhaps be helpful, and it could be combined into a shared resource that they can keep and use throughout the rest of the course. All right, so got about 6 minutes left to go. So I wanted to open it up for questions, comments, thoughts that folks would like to share. If you have activities that you've used that have been helpful, if you have any key takeaways or key action steps that you're going to have based on what we talked about today, please feel free to share those. Again, questions in the Q&A if you want to make sure that I see them, or you can add them to the chat as well. So we'll open it up in these last couple of minutes to questions, comments, and thoughts that folks would like to share. Thank you, Phoebe. Yeah. Yeah, allowed us to put ourselves in our students' shoes and try different approaches. And I think that's a really great point, right? Anything that we can do to think about things from the perspective of a student, I think is really helpful. I know in our courses, we've been lucky enough for the courses that we teach for credit in the libraries to have a student assistant who came in and actually took our courses as her employment. That was her job. And she took those courses and gave great feedback from the perspective of a student, and even created some videos to explain to the students directly what her perspective on those assignments. So yeah, anything that we can do to get the perspective of a student, I think, is really great. Yes, Kate, this definitely ties in with tilting. Absolutely. I was going to put tilt in here, but I was like, I've talked about tilt a lot. So yeah. Thank you all. Thank you. Oh, let's see. We've got a question in the Q&A here. All right. So I met with her writing across the college director over the last few years. We always debate having students learn this terminology versus giving them more verb-like instructions. Find a book versus library catalog. That's a great question, Jamie. That article that I cited that was published in the past couple of months had some thoughts on that one, I think. But I think that find a book based on my reading of this concept, that the verb-like instructions are more understandable than something like library catalog. So I think that we do have to think about it's, what not what the terminology that's going to make most sense to us, but what students are trying to accomplish by using our site. And so a term like find a book is going to be something that is going to allow them to accomplish their goal rather than, library catalog. That's my thought based on the research that I've read. But again, others may have different responses there as well. Thank you for that question. Stephanie shared, I will be doing a glossary of key terms, do an assignment annotation so students can get practice and teachers can see. That is wonderful, Stephanie. I'm so excited to hear that. This has been wonderful. Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much for being here today. And again, I'll stick around, but I'm going to go ahead and stop recording now.